cerebrospinal fluid. So let's uncover together. So deep within the brain, we have chambers. We have chambers that are specially equipped for production and circulation of the fluid that is known as the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid. So we have chambers. We have like rooms that are specialized for production and circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. So this system of chambers is what we call the brain ventricular system. So the ventricles of the brain, How many ventricles do we have? We have four ventricles. And to begin with, we have the lateral ventricles. We have two lateral ventricles, one on the left and one on the right. One on the left and one on the right. So we have two lateral ventricles, left lateral ventricle and the right lateral ventricle. And then we have the third ventricle, which is one. So we have one third ventricle. So we have two lateral ventricles and one third ventricle. And then we have the last ventricle, which is the fourth ventricle. So how many in total? We have four ventricles, two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fifth and the fourth ventricles. So all these ventricles are associated with the production and circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid, the plumbing system, this is the brain plumbing system, something like that. So where are the location of these ventricles? So the two lateral ventricles are found within the cerebral hemisphere. So within the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere lies the lateral ventricles. And the lateral ventricles are C-shaped and they maintain constant relationship with the corpus callosum. So this is the left lateral ventricle and that is the right lateral ventricle. This is the third ventricle. The third ventricle is located within the diencephalon. The two lateral ventricles were found within the cerebral hemispheres, but the third ventricle is found within the diencephalon. What about the fourth ventricle? Where the fourth ventricle is bound by the cerebellum on behind and above, and then on the something like floor, we can say it is made up of the the pons and medulla. So these are the boundaries of the fourth ventricle. So the cerebellum on behind, and the pons and the medulla on the front page. So because we have said this ventricles associated with production and circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, so it means these ventricles are connected to one another. So what are the connections? What are the gates? What are the gates between the ventricles? Let's uncover together. So we have the left and right lateral ventricles, and left and right lateral ventricles will project the fluid, will direct the cerebrospinal fluid to the third ventricle, So it means we should have gates, we should have something like a doors between the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle. What is the name for that gate? That would be the interventricular foramen between two ventricles. Interventricular foramen also is known as the foramen of Monroe. So we have the interventricular foramen, which is also known as the foramen of Monroe. This is the foramen of Monroe. So we have two foramen of Monroe because one is on the left side that communicates the left lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, and then we have one on the right that communicates the right lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. So two interventricular foramina of Monroe. And then from the third ventricle now, the cerebrospinal fluid will go to the fourth ventricle. So we should have a connection between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. And that connection, that gate, is what we call the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. The cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. Remember, I have told you the third ventricle is within the diencephalon, and now I'm telling you that the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius lies within the brainstem. So it lies within the brainstem, specifically within the midbrain. So it's found within the midbrain, something like a central canal of the midbrain. Well, we have already seen how this, how these ventricles communicate to one another, but how does this fluid leaves the ventricular system? So after the fluid has been formed, within the ventricles, and it has, circulated within the ventricles, it has to leave the ventricular system. It has to go out of the ventricles, to go to the subarachnoid spaces. And how does it leave to the subarachnoid spaces? Well, we have got the apertures that will enable this cerebrospinal fluid to leave the ventricles. So we have the apertures on the lateral surfaces. So we have got them the lateral apertures. So the lateral apertures, or the so-called the foramen of Rushika. So we have two foramina of Rushika, one on the left and one on the right. I will emphasize it soon. I will show you it soon in the next slide. And then we have the median aperture, something like behind the posterior, which is called the median aperture, or the foramen of Magendie. The median aperture or the foramen of Magendie. Let me show you the three-dimension orientation of these ventricles. So no confusion. This was the right ventricle, right? No confusion. And this is this is on the right side. Say the right lateral ventricle. This is the left lateral ventricle. They communicate with the third ventricle through the interventricular between two ventricles, interventricular foramen of Monroe. So we can call the interventricular foramen or the foramen of Monroe. So we have one on the right, one on the left, no confusion. And then the fluid goes to the third ventricle, and then from third ventricle it goes to the fourth ventricle by the way of the aqueduct of Sylvius. So you can call it the cerebral aqueduct or the aqueduct of Sylvius. Same thing. So cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius, or someone can call the aqueduct of the midbrain because it is found within the midbrain. No confusion, no worry, no big about that. Okay, so from the fourth ventricle, now I've told you this fluid has to leave the ventricular system. So how does it get access out of the ventricular system? Well, it uses the lateral foramina or the foramina of Rushika. So one on the right and one on the left, no confusion. So we have two foramina of Rushika, one on the left and one on the right, no confusion. And then we have a median aperture. So this one is a little bit not clearly indicated, but not seen clearly from this picture, but it doesn't mean this fluid goes to the central canal. Of course, part of the cerebrospinal fluid will go to the central canal, but doesn't go to the central canal by using the foramen of Magendie. It uses the foramina, the obex. Remember the obex we discussed in the brainstem, the surface anatomy of the brainstem. So we have the obex that helps you this fluid to go to the cerebrospinal, to the central canal. And then on the posterior we have the foramen of Rushika, foramen of Magendie, that helps this cerebrospinal fluid to leave the ventricular system to go to the arachnoid space. So guys, you cannot afford to forget these structures. You cannot afford to forget these foramina. They are equally important, and don't go to your exam without knowing these structures ever. But there is always confusion between the foramen of Rushika and the foramen of Magendie. At least these upstairs, people don't confuse them most. But these two, like the foramen of Rushika and foramen of Magendie, they are confused several times. So I got you big time. I got you back big time, because I've got a mnemonic for you. And number one, so think of the lateral ventricle, the lateral foramen or the lateral aperture. It starts with letter L. So L for lateral will be for Rushika. So the foramen of Rushika will always be on the lateral side. So the lateral apertures will be the foramen of Rushika. You cannot forget. And then think about the median. Median starts with the letter M. So what does it tell us? So M will be for Magendie. So M, median, M, and M for Magendie. So the foramen of Magendie will be median. So the median aperture is the foramen of Magendie. Easy peasy, right? No confusion. Okay, so let's discuss about the parts of the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle is a C-shaped. It is a C-shaped ventricle, and it accounts one of the structures within the brain that are C-shaped. They form the letter C. So it has got parts. I mean, and the parts are named depending on what, within what lobe of the cerebral hemisphere is that part found. For example, we have got anterior horn. The anterior horn is within the frontal lobe, and so this anterior horn can be called the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle. No confusion. So the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle, and then we have the posterior horn. The posterior horn is found within the occipital lobe, so we can call the occipital horn of the lateral ventricle. Easy peasy. And then we have got an inferior horn. The inferior horn is found within which lobe? So it is found within the temporal lobe, so it can also be called a temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. So we have the anterior horn, occipital horn. You have the frontal horn, occipital horn, and the temporal horn. Or we have the frontal, anterior, posterior, and the inferior horn. And then also got a body, the body of the lateral ventricle, and then we have got a splenium somewhere around here, because where is the anterior horn, the posterior horn, and then inferior horn meet together. So let's talk about the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is produced within the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle, and it is produced by the special structures that they are called the choroidal plexus. So the choroid plexus are the one that produces or secretes the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid, it is produced by the choroid plexus. Where are these choroid plexus? They are found within the lateral ventricles, left and right. Remember, they are within the third ventricles. You see, these are these reddish stars here. These are the choroid plexus, and they are within the fourth ventricle as well. But at the greater percent, they are found within the lateral ventricles. So an average person, an average adult like you and I, we've got an approximately 150 mils of the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid that we produce, I mean, when you go through our ventricles, what you get in terms of, if you get access to measure our cerebrospinal fluid, you will find that at any time t, our ventricles can only accommodate our whole ventricular system and the subarachnoid space. They can accommodate only 150 mils or 150 cc of the cerebrospinal fluid. So that's what we can accommodate. So but the rate of production of the cerebrospinal fluid, the rate of secretion of the cerebrospinal fluid is approximately 20 cc per hour, 20 mils per hour. So in a span of 24 hours, an average adult has can produce 500 cc of the cerebrospinal fluid. So you see what we have, like our brain, our ventricles, our whole system can accommodate only 150 mils, but the rate of production is 150, is 500 mils per day. So we produce 500 mils per day, but the ventricles the system can accommodate only 150 mils. So what does it mean? It means we roughly have got 3 cycles of the cerebrospinal fluid production and reabsorption. So this means that we produce, it circulates, it is reabsorbed. We produce another cycle, it circulates, it is reabsorbed, and then the cycle continues. So in an average of 3 cycles a day, a normal person produces. So what is the circulation? What is the load of circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid? So the cerebrospinal fluid, after it has been produced by the lateral ventricles and third ventricles, so from the lateral ventricles it goes to the third ventricles through what we have said already, that is interventricular foramen or the foramen of Monroe, and then from the third ventricle it goes to the fourth ventricle by the way of the cerebral aqueduct or the aqueduct of Sylvius or the aqueduct of the midbrain. This is the midbrain, the aqueduct of the midbrain. It goes to the lateral ventricles, to the fourth ventricle, and then from fourth ventricle now we have got routes from which the cerebrospinal fluid, it leaves the ventricular system, it leaves the fourth ventricle now, you see. So number one, we have got the foramina frugica, you see, because this is the sagittal section and we are looking at the right side of the brain, so it means we can see only the right lateral aperture, or the foramina frugica, which is on the lateral side. And then now see, we have the posterior. From the posterior side, we have got the foramen of Magendie, from which, you know, it goes. So the cerebrospinal fluid moves from the lateral ventricle to go to the subarachnoid space through the foramen of frugica, the lateral one, and the foramen of Magendie, the median one. But the cerebrospinal fluid also goes to the central canal of the spinal cord. So this is the central canal of the spinal cord, and it goes there by the way of the orbix. So remember, we have something like the orbix here, and we discussed it in the brainstem, that it is, you know, used by the cerebrospinal fluid to live from the fourth ventricle all the way to the central canal of the spinal cord. So in summary, is the cerebrospinal fluid comes from the ventricles and it goes to the subarachnoid space, and the central canal of the spinal cord. And then in subarachnoid space now, this fluid will flow in the subarachnoid space. It flows in the subarachnoid space, and then we're going to see that it is absorbed by the so-called arachnoid granulation. So the cerebrospinal fluid is being absorbed by the arachnoid granulation. So we have these stuffs here whose function is to absorb the cerebrospinal fluid, and then so it is absorbed, and then it goes to the durovenous sinuses, and the important one is this superior sagittal sinus. So the superior sagittal sinus is very important in absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. But I am telling you that the structures that are essential, that are purposely made to absorb the cerebrospinal fluid, would be the arachnoid granulation. So the arachnoid. So if at all the question asked about the structure that is responsible for absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid, you will name arachnoid granulation and know the superior sagittal sinus. And of course, after this cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed, it is presented to the the superior sagittal sinus, among other dural sinuses. Okay. So that's a bit of circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, from production to circulation and to reabsorption. So as I've told you, we have the choroid plexus, they produce the cerebrospinal fluid at a constant rate. So they produce at a constant rate. At a day, at a time of 24 hours, it produces 500 of the cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal has to circulate and be reabsorbed back. So in the next video, I think we will discuss on how pathologies that will result into discrepancies between production and reabsorption, and you see what clinical implication it can have. So is there a function of this cerebrospinal fluid? Yes, of course. The cerebrospinal fluid, one among the very important thing that it does, it is another layer of protection of the brain. So the brain is being protected by several layers. We discussed them separately, but one among the level of protection is the use of the cerebrospinal fluid. So it has got the mechanical protection in case we say that so it gives like the shock absorbing environment. So when your brain is subjected to shock or something like something like a shock, it is when, for example, you are hit, the brain would just go to the lateral, would hit the lateral. the rigid skull, so it will hit the rigid skull, and the skull is rigid. So to avoid that, we've got the cerebrospinal fluid that acts like a shock absorber. So it gives the buoyancy to the brain. It gives the buoyancy to the brain. So in other words, your brain floats in the skull because of the presence of the cerebrospinal fluid. Well, an average person like you and I, our brains weigh about 1.3 to 1.4 kgs. So 1.3 to 1.4 kgs. But with the presence of the cerebrospinal fluid, the weight of the brain drops to 150 grams. So from 1.4, 1.3 kg to 150 grams. That's the help of the cerebrospinal fluid. So it provides buoyancy, and the brain floats within the skull by the aid of the cerebrospinal fluid. But it also gives like chemical, a good chemical environment for neurotransmission. So neurotransmission has got something like important ions that responsible for conduction of the nerve impulse, and of course it also helps to grab the waste product of the from the brain. So the waste product, the carbon dioxide and all the products of metabolism are being carried by the cerebrospinal fluid, and of course it supplies the nutrient to different parts. It supplies nutrient to different parts of the brain, and that's the cerebrospinal fluid. So that is it from today's discussion. Next time we meet, we discuss about the clinical correlates of the cerebrospinal fluid, the hydrocephalus, and all that. So see you next time.